I'm Professor Robert Bickel, Director of the SEER program here at the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School. And on behalf of the program and the school, I would like to extend a sincere welcome to the 9th Annual SEER Symposium on Values Inclusive Business, Seizing the Moment. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, SEER stands for Social, Ethical, and Environmental Responsibility. It's a holistic strategic mindset that includes values and believes that those values are the key to creating both long-term competitive advantage as well as long-term value to all stakeholders. Built off of the groundbreaking business model of Patagonia, the mindset recognizes that there are 4 inherent macro values that are endemic to all businesses and organizations of any type. First, social responsibility, a focus on stakeholders, human stakeholders, throughout the entire value chain. Second, environmental stewardship, the need to protect and promote healthy ecosystems and natural environments wherever the business touches. Third, financial strength, without which no organization can thrive long-term. And last, a focus on product and/or service quality, the need to create meaningful, lasting value to customers and all key constituents. Now, the key to the mindset is that these values operate as a system. They can pull apart from one another, or they can collaborate with one another. It's therefore the SEER strategist's job to look for synergies, of course, such as when waste streams can become new material flows for new or existing products, or when investments in the community can enhance things like employee engagement, retention, and attraction. However, it is also important, if not more important, to recognize that there are persistent tensions between these values. And it is only by acknowledging and embracing these tensions that we can unlock truly innovative strategies to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Now, for the last 10 years or a little bit longer, the SEER program has served as a visible artifact of the school's commitment to the principles of responsible management education. In addition, the program has served as a locus and a hub for values-inclusive business in Los Angeles, California, and the world. And most important, it is a linchpin in the school's commitment to creating and cultivating the next generation of best for the world leaders. Now, about a year ago, I welcomed an enthusiastic crowd of MBAs, business community members, entrepreneurs, and our larger community into a packed hall in Santa Monica to explore what we looked at as the new purpose of business, prompted by a chorus of voices from the World Economic Forum to the Business Roundtable and beyond that were calling for a new expansive definition of what business stood for, one that served stakeholders beyond just investors, and one which could begin to address the most pressing needs of our society, including climate change and income inequality. We saw this, all of our speakers that day spoke to what appeared to be an inflection point in industry and across sectors, that industry could become more evolved, more inclusive, more just, more equitable. We recognized that there were steep challenges and deep divisions, but overall there was a tone of optimism that business could begin to make the heavy lifts necessary to create that just, equitable, and sustainable future. Well, what a difference a year makes. We are now looking at pandemic-induced lockdowns, a year where the economic standstill has exposed deep fragilities in our economy, especially the vulnerabilities of the most disenfranchised and poorest segments of our population. Meanwhile, racial justice issues boiled over into mass demonstrations and a truly global movement looking to address hundreds of years of structural inequity. At the same time, climate change manifested itself in tangible ways across the world, almost poetically, through fires, and most recently, through ice. And last, there was the pervasive stark polarization that challenged and even threatened at times our national and all too often our personal discourse. It seemed like we were getting a masterclass in how black swan events and wicked problems could collide together at global scale. And in the hindsight, we might be forgiven for thinking that the optimism of last year's event was sorely misplaced, or at the very least, extremely naive. However, there is a saying that people, and by extension organizations, change for one of two fundamental motivations: inspiration or desperation. With that in mind, the theme for this year is seizing the moment, looking at this great pause, as it's been called, as a space to examine how these multiple overlapping crises present an opportunity to rewrite the status quo. We will hear today from our speakers about efforts to extend and use finance to extend financial and economic opportunity to underserved populations. We will listen to a discussion of the struggle for attention and trust in the nation's media landscape. We will hear about exciting opportunities to transform our take, make, waste linear economy into a circular economy that provides benefits to both the environment as well as to humankind. And we will also hear about the future of creating stability and sustainability in our nation's strained food system. All the speakers that you will hear from today speak in part to this idea of rewriting the rules of the game. If we've learned anything from this past year, is that nothing should be taken for granted. We've seen how quickly life, work, and even the basic components of society itself can change, adapt, recombine to adapt to these new modes and new conditions on the ground. And I fervently believe, that in our understandable and justifiable scramble for a return to normal, that we don't necessarily have to return to the status quo ante. Rather, we can anticipate and co-create a new normal, one that actually serves to facilitate that just, equitable, and sustainable future we all deserve and require. So with that, I look forward to our participation together at this symposium, at this very exciting and charged moment in our species history. A little bit of housekeeping. We will be having a live Q&A session at the end after all the speakers have had their say. However, we will be asking for your questions throughout the entire event. So please log them in the chat or whatever mode is available. And we have a team of dedicated SEER MBAs looking forward to collecting and collating your questions for the speakers today. So with that, thank you. And again, a hearty welcome to this year's 9th Annual SEER Symposium, Seizing the Moment. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend of many years, Wole Coaxum, who's using his deep experience in finance and especially his new company, Mobility Capital Finance, to work within and change the financial industry to extend opportunity to unserved or underserved populations. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Wole Coaxum, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mobility Capital Finance, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of the SEER Symposium series and speaking with you today. My topic today is just around financial services as infrastructure and imagining a new form of partnership to address one of this country's most challenging issues, which is around how do you create financial inclusion for folks all across the country. And although it's a cliche, financial technology does have the ability to democratize financial services in this country in a way that it hasn't happened before. We have the promise of financial inclusion can only occur if people are committed. There is the technology, there is the talent, and there is the partnership and the capital to make it work. And what's most exciting, I think, about this moment in our country is that all these pieces seem to be coming together at the same time or at the right time that allows us to potentially collaborate, private sector, public sector, as well as the philanthropic sector, to create a new paradigm in terms of how we may bring financial services to folks in this country. It's interesting, in this period of economic recovery from the pandemic, we don't want to miss the moment to move ourselves into a place that solves the immediate problem, but in solving the immediate problem leaves a long-standing foundation that will allow many Americans and all of our residents to be a part of the financial mainstream. Before I go into the solution, I just want to take a moment to give you a little background about myself. I had my George Floyd moment at the death of Michael Brown in 2014. And at that time, I was one of the most senior people at JP Morgan, running small business sales and strategy. And one of the things that really struck me at that time was the imagery of the folks fighting for social justice in light of the death of Michael Brown. And those scenes reminded me very much of a documentary called Eyes on the Prize, which captured the civil rights movement in the 60s, 50s and 60s, and into actually the early 70s. And the images of 2014 felt a lot like the same things that were happening at that time. And a lot of the concern in the 60s was around economic justice and social justice. And it seemed like we were in the same place. And the issues around economic justice were one that, if without that plan, I couldn't see how you could have a social justice agenda that would be in a position to move communities of color forward in this country. And I thought that my time at JP Morgan would be better served trying to get into the fight, if you will, in financial services to try to solve this issue of financial inclusion, recognizing that traditional banks aren't in a position to solve this issue because their financial model doesn't support it. One of the projects that I was working on when I was running business banking sales and strategy was, how do you move customers to digital solutions? And it became really imperative, actually, if you were able to move individuals or small businesses to use the ATM machines, to use the mobile app, you could actually significantly reduce the cost of serving that customer and increase their overall customer satisfaction. So the aha moment for me was, well, geez, technology actually can make unprofitable customers profitable. They can allow you to reach customers more efficiently, and the customer satisfaction is higher. So if you took that frame and applied it to this intractable problem of financial services for underserved people, and the underserved community in this country is 55%, Black and brown communities are unbanked or underbanked. I thought, what, we might be onto something, and I'm better positioned to solve this problem outside as an entrepreneur than inside the traditional banks, because their business model just doesn't support it. So I left and created Mochify. And Mochify is committed to closing the wealth gap in this country using technology. And what we've created is a neobank that has all of the trappings, if you will, of the best fintechs in the country, whether it's Chime or VAR or MoneyLion, but we're very intentional in terms of wanting to work with underserved communities in this country. The interesting thing is having access to a bank account for a Black or Latinx individual can save that individual anywhere from 50 to 100% in fees vis-a-vis their white counterpart. Said another way, a Black person spends 50% more in banking than his or her white counterpart, and the Latinx person spends 100% more a month for banking services. And so what we've built is a mobile first platform that allows you to get a demand deposit account, no fees to open the account, no minimum balance. At the same time, we are able to allow our customers to go into the stores in their community, the Family Dollar, the Dollar General. They can put cash into their account for free. We've got a free ATM network that allows people to get cash out of their account for free and to get free check cashing. At the same time, we have check writing capability, and it's MasterCard branded anywhere MasterCard's accepted. And at the same time, we're allowed to, or we've enabled our customers to take their rent payments and report those to the credit bureaus. And it's a pretty powerful thing because rent payments to the credit bureaus is something that allows you to significantly impact your credit score. There was an analysis done by Experian that took individuals who lived in public housing in New York City and said, well, if you took your rent and you reported that to the credit bureaus, what would the impact of that be on their credit score? And it turned out that enabled the individual to go from a thin to no credit file to becoming a 700 credit score or better with the credit bureaus. So it's pretty powerful in terms of the impact that adding rent, I should say, to your credit score can have. And we've done that on our platform, and we have been thinking about other payments as well, utility payments, water payments, cable payments, and adding that to the credit bill or credit file to help the individual build his or her credit. So that's the platform we've built. It's pretty exciting. It's one of the leading platforms in the country around this, but again, focused on folks who traditionally have been relegated to the check cashers, the pawn shops, and the payday lenders. But the part that's so exciting for us in our business model is are we able to take our business and do it at scale? And the ability to do it at scale is the key, because the customer base that we're working with, they tend to be more transactors than they are individuals who leave significant balances in their accounts. And that is what makes this customer base less attractive to traditional brick and mortar banks, and which is why things like overdraft fees and ATM fees have become so important to the banking model to serve this customer, because the banks don't have any other way to make any money on these folks besides these excess fees. So the banks walked away from this customer. 80% of the bank branches that have closed in this country have been in low and moderate income communities. Our platform changes the game on that in the way I just described, but you still need to get to the individual in a low cost way. Otherwise, there's not enough economics to make it work. So what we figured out was this idea of financial services as infrastructure. And we believe that the right solution is actually working with mayors in this country who are responsible for thinking about things like clean water, who are responsible for thinking about things such as shoveling the snow or making sure that everyone has equal access to safe transit in this country. And so, or that make sure that the garbage is collected for all residents. And we think that financial services is the same thing. And that through mayors, they're in a position to take the infrastructure that we've built, white label it, put their brand on it, and then make it a part of how city services are delivered to residents in the community. Let me give you an example. So in the summer of 2020, the mayor of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti, said he wanted to create contactless digital first government for the residents of Los Angeles. What he envisioned was what I'll call single sign-on into all city government services in Los Angeles. So they created a single account called the Angelino card. And then that Angelino card, that single sign-on, would then allow for all residents and small businesses to make payments to the city electronically or receive money back from the city electronically in the form of refunds and things like that. And the question was like, how do you do that in a city where 20% of the neighborhoods don't have a bank branch, and it ranks number 3 in the country in terms of unbanked, and finally it collects $1 million a day in fees from the water company in cash. And so it was that point the city went out and did a survey of the marketplace and said, who can help us drive the financial inclusion component of the conversation? And they asked us to do that. And so as a result, Mochify is now launching the Angelino card, which is this bank account. It's a MasterCard branded card in the name of Los Angeles. And it is the contactless, has the latest technology, and it's going to be made available to every Angelino. And we're having a small business version coming out as well that allows anybody to now get access to a high quality, low cost bank account that gives them access to digital government and digital services. This is very exciting. Just imagine how it transforms that community. And what we're doing on top of that is creating incentives for people to shop locally so people can keep the dollar circulating in Los Angeles communities. We're creating partnerships with community groups all across the city of Los Angeles, from faith-based organizations to service organizations like the United Way, to immigrant groups. They say, hey, now you've got a product that can, or a solution that's brought to you by the city that can solve some of your policy and agenda related to your programmatic needs. So anyway, so we think that is going to become a model. And what's really neat is the more that the city uses the platform, the less paper it has to expend in terms of paper checks. Everything is delivered digitally. And so the city sees a cost savings. The individuals are able to bring down their costs. They don't check cashing fees, no standing in line to go to other alternative financial services companies, services, pawn shops, pay lenders, check cashers. And then we were able to build a sustainable business model that has revenue associated with it. And the more people use it, the lower the cost to the city, no cost to the individual, and the greater revenue potential that we've got. We've got a pipeline of cities that include Honolulu, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Miami, New Orleans, all fall in the same thing. And so we think that working with the city structure enables us to deliver a whole new framework of bringing financial services to communities, particularly underserved communities, helps build their credit and helps them move down the path of financial empowerment. And we can really address the issue of financial inclusion in this country. And I look forward to spending time talking to you about this in more detail. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Wole. And now we will hear about the state of media and information and truth in the United States and beyond from another good friend of mine, David Folkenflik, Senior Media Correspondent for National Public Radio.
Hi there, it's David Folkenflik. I'm glad to join you at what I think of as the Robert Simon Bickel sweepstakes. Actually delighted to be joining you even in this virtual way, although I think there's a cruel irony in that Rob, a child of Connecticut, is out there in the glorious Western Shores and working for Pepperdine, while I, a child of the beaches of Orange County, am raising my kids in suburban New Jersey. Go figure. I'm delighted to join you at this SEER conference, even if I can't see you, and that may be a cruel thing to say, given that a year into this pandemic, you're still being subjected to dad jokes by friends of Rob's. But I cover the news media for NPR, and so I wanted to share with you a little bit today about some of the things that we wrestle with. We wrestle with both in terms of being journalists at NPR, and we wrestle with in terms of covering in the news media. I want to start with two quotes that you may well be thoroughly sick of by now. The first is the quote that I'm sure you've heard in regard to this. I may disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That is, of course, attributed to Voltaire. It's almost certain that he never said it. But it's said to reflect his sensibilities. The second quote we've heard a lot in recent years, certainly in my business, perhaps in those that you're interested in, but phrases from the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a great senator from the state of New York, formerly a federal civil servant. And he said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And the idea is that we should have a common set of facts, a basis from which we can go forth into the world and argue. It is the civic underpinnings of journalism, something we don't always talk about, something that sometimes self-importantly we do. But the idea being that we should have a standard set of facts and information on which we can develop thoughts about how best to respond to things, how best to approach things, how to think about things, what policies might well address it, whether we should address something at all. And we simply don't have that. Now, it seems to be almost certain that Daniel Patrick Moynihan didn't say that, or at least wasn't the first to say that. That is, that it's also been attributed in congressional testimony to a former defense secretary named James Schlesinger. Before that, a version of it was attributed to the philosopher Bernard Baruch. So there are, even in arguing about facts, we find that the things that we think are grounded and that people allude to when they talk about fact and opinion, Voltaire, Moynihan, may not be the case. If we think about news events, major events of recent times, almost all of them have been contested not only in terms of ideological schisms about how we should deal with it as a society and politically, but also in terms of what facts we have established as true. If you think about, obviously, the 2020 elections, if you think about what we think to have been facts about COVID-19, if you think about the arguments that we've seen play out in news pages and programs about climate change, if you think even about the argument over what happened with the withdrawal of books, the cancellation of books by Dr. Seuss deemed to have racist or offensive material in it, as a society, we don't have a common set of facts to argue from. If you look at the Dr. Seuss case, as frivolous as it may seem, and as symbolically serious as it may be, coverage of it have reflected the tenor in many outlets, particularly those on the right, but not exclusively, that this was a cancellation, that woke and progressives, people of color who are part of the BLM movement, however you want to cast it, in outraged ways, shoved this down the American public's throats, that these books were racist and had to be taken off. In fact, the estate of Dr. Seuss decided in the moment that we live in, whether out of genuine concern or as a publicity stunt or what have you, to remove the books voluntarily. That's not cancel culture, that's corporate decision-making. But the way we've seen it covered is in the context of this argument over the degree to which there is cancel culture in our campuses, in our corporate rooms, in our society. Journalism is fallible. Journalism is mortal. But journalism, by and large, is populated by people who want to do interesting stories and get out the facts. They are as I've said, fallible. But in making mistakes, it plays into critics of the media. And I'm a paid professional critic in some ways. So that's okay with me. And it's okay with me that people are often ideologically driven or have motivations for their criticism. What I think we've seen is an incredible onslaught of criticism that is asymmetrical and therefore difficult for the press to deal with. If you talk about the media might say, well, if you're pissing people off on the left and you're pissing people off on the right, you're doing something right. If both sides are angry at you, you sometimes hear this in newsrooms, you're doing something right. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Sometimes it means that there's a great component of the community or of society that just doesn't believe in you or trust you. And I think that's a problem. I think it's a little glib to say if you're pissing everybody off, you're doing something right. And so we have to work on that. The asymmetric attacks are the fact that one of the major political parties in this country, whether you like its policies or not, whether you like its personalities or not, has embraced as part of its primary rhetorical fuel the idea that the media is against the people who belong to that party and their agenda, and in fact, their very fiber of being. I think this is just factually untrue. In part because news organizations across the country, including hundreds of our member stations across the country, consist of people who live in those communities, who are part of those families. And whether or not there's an equal ideological distribution of people in newsrooms to the country at large, they are part of the fabric of American life too. They are hurting during this pandemic and grieving. They are losing jobs during this pandemic and during this economic crisis, and struggling, and through a terribly complicated and difficult restructuring of the industry itself. And therefore, the idea that somehow they are apart from, except perhaps at the highest levels of media, the most celebrity levels of media, those folks who get the headlines not just written by themselves, but about themselves. I think that proposition is just wrong, but it is effective. It is effective deflection of the Republican Party's papering over of its internal divisions and chasms, and the disparate nature between the ways in which policies are written for the benefit of certain elements of the party and the ways in which the party's support is driven by people who don't always benefit from those policies and often, in fact, don't. But partly we're in this opinion age, and our conception of journalism is often driven by market forces that are dressed up into the garb of somehow being principled. So before World War II, from the founding of the Republic, the press was an opinionated press, as you may well know already. And they were subsidized newsletters and newspapers and magazines and pamphlets by often political interests, corporate interests, sometimes religious groups. You often see it reflected in the nature of the name of the publication themselves. There's Foster's Daily Democrat in New Hampshire. There's the Waterbury Republican American in Connecticut. These are news organizations that are the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, New York, where I was born, lived briefly. These are names reflective of the interest that funded them. I'm certain the Manchester Union Leader, one of the most politically conservative daily newspapers in the country, had something to do with the unions back in the day of its founding. And yet, as newspapers narrowed, particularly after World War II, what you found was that as a market play, newspapers didn't want to appear to narrow political beliefs or interests. They needed to appeal to a broader audience. So they took a service like the Associated Press, built up during World War II, comprising hundreds of members across the country, and having to do the most straightforward, non-ideological, non-opinionated coverage in order to be picked up by all those clients. And they started to go towards that. And so you started to hear about the need for objectivity in journalism and getting away oftentimes from point of view. And that really was about trying to acquire the largest market share. So in places like Baltimore, which once had a dozen newspapers, where I went to work, by the time I went there in 1994, there were 2 daily newspapers owned by the same owner. It was really just an afternoon edition of the morning paper. And they were collapsed within a year of my arrival. In fact, on my birthday in 1995. And so suddenly Baltimore had 1 newspaper, and it meant that you didn't have to differentiate. You wanted to beam as broad a net as possible. And that lasted until, interestingly, about a year later, where it was true for newspapers, but suddenly it wasn't true for the explosion of other news organizations. 1996, CNN had been around for 15 years, but suddenly that year was the arrival of MSNBC, at that time a child of both NBC and Microsoft, old media and new, and of course Fox News from Rupert Murdoch's outfit. And in 1996, of course, was the birth of the consumer World Wide Web, where people could start to post things and have them be viewed by almost anyone all across the world with a simple and annoying dial tone ring up. And over time, to the present age, you ended up having narrowcasting that makes big money. And so in a sense, it incentivized a pure form of argumentation, a more, shall we say, intense screening of facts that aren't useful to the side you're arguing for. And it incentivized a lot of BS. I think there are exceptions. Right now, you're seeing the New York Times and the Washington Post finally capitalizing on the promise of digital to create national and even international digital subscription base that has overtaken the importance of, to some degree, their print subscriptions and overtaken the importance of their regional rooted loyalties from their subscribers, so that the incremental cost of each digital subscription is almost nothing. So you have millions and millions and millions of subscribers helping to support what they do, and they are starting to become, particularly in the case of the Times, bigger than they've ever been. Those are individual strategies, not a model for news organizations. But what they did during the Trump years was capitalize on an appetite and a hunger to combat Trumpism. And that's complicated for those news organizations, which are at the same time trying to still broadcast and reach a wider audience of people who are not simply activated by Trump. And they're going to have to hold on to those readers. I think they will, but they're not going to grow as big in Trump's absence. These are individual strategies, not a model for the survival of local news around the country. And it's not a model for the survival of facts in any place other than the Times and the Post, and to some degree, the Wall Street Journal, which has terrific news report. If you think about the way in which we're entering the Biden age, which is a calmer age, which is an age of so far less contention and less false claims for everything except perhaps the assault and siege of Congress on January 6th. There's the question of, are we going to give credence to sources who've proven themselves willing to say things that are untrue? There's a producer for The Daily Show, who's a former reporter named Matt Negrin, who has essentially waged a kind of war on Meet the Press and other Sunday talk shows for inviting back senators, in particular Republican senators, I must say, who propagated false claims and what were clearly, after a certain point, lies about Joe Biden in the election of 2020. Who would not acknowledge that he won, who made claims of great fears of widespread voter fraud in the absence of any such evidence. Very much reminiscent of claims about President Obama's heritage, where he was born, efforts to delegitimize him. It's not that liberals and Democrats don't go after the press. I think they were deeply angry in this country in 2000 when the recount of the 2000 election ultimately was found to uphold then Governor Bush's victory, and people wanted the press to be the ones to take that on and take that down. People on the left didn't happen. The failure to hold the Bush administration responsible in any way for the 9/11 attacks, what proved out to be unfounded claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the treatment of Hillary Clinton. There are reasons why liberals also have issues with the press, but it's a different argument. And we have been, in the years since 1996, ultimately, I think, overwhelmed by a tsunami of BS, significant degree from Fox News, from Facebook and Reddit and Twitter. Think of the audiences. Something like 750,000 hours of video are uploaded every day to YouTube. I've talked to officials at YouTube and at Google. They can't keep up. They can't take down all the things which are hateful, or attempts to inspire violence, or attempts to cultivate falsehoods and send them coursing through the bloodstream. Think about Facebook. It claims 2.8 billion users monthly, distinct users monthly, nearly 1.8 billion each day. And that has overwhelmed the ability of Mark Zuckerberg and his team to even pretend to have a handle on what's going on. They're always chasing the last scandal. They're always appeasing the critics of the last outrage. They're most definitely trying to appease folks on the right who say that somehow the social media outfits have been unfair to them. I think that's proven to be untrue. But as they sought to have some rules, as they even welcomed certain degree of regulation so it would relieve them of the burden of figuring out what to do, you see these alternative platforms, Gab and Parler. I never know if it, I think it's Parlay rather than Parler, but nonetheless, InfoWars, RT, sponsored by the Russians directly, Gateway Pundit, fueled by its information and misinformation. Joe Biden calls it malarkey. Jon Stewart used to call it, forgive me, bullshit mountain. These are now the waters that we swim in. And it's very complicated to tell right from wrong. I think if you look at major news organizations like mine, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, they do tremendous work. But Marty Baron, the famous executive editor of the Washington Post, who's just stepping down, said that he thinks this is the challenge of our time, is how main news organizations, as well as social media platforms, can get a handle on misinformation, how they can, in a sense, own their franchise, present to the public a report they can rely upon to come up with the information they need to then develop their own views about how society should function, how they should cast their votes, what they should patronize, and where they should go. And to go back to the Dr. Seuss example, among the stories that was not, shall we say, withdrawn, were the Sneetches, which if we had more time, I would read today because it's instructive. It is about two groups of Sneetches, one of which has a star on its belly and the other which does not have a star upon theirs. And as there is a tension, you might almost say an ethnic or racial animus that develops between the two groups and a jealousy over who has it and who does not. Guy comes to town with a machine promising to put stars on the belly of those Sneetches that don't have them. And then he charges them for that. And then he charges the others who want to be different to take the stars off theirs. And at a certain point, you get the realization that he is removing the information they need to evaluate their society. But at the same time, they're also, while being completely impoverished, realizing that they don't even remember who they were at the start. And it is really a story about tolerance and inclusion and not getting flipped out over differences. And it's actually a story with an affirming intent. But to me, it's also a really scary parable about misinformation and how malevolent actors can overwhelm a society that is trying to go about living its lives, but would prefer to have information about their world, even if in that case, some of the information that was important to them was information they used to exclude and divide. Two different ways to read the same story with very different lessons being derived. But I think that we need to do the best we can to figure out what information is valuable. Simply the ability to look at firsthand information doesn't override the inability to just process and sift through the fire hose of material that's coming in through us through these digital portals every moment. That is the challenge of the media. But I got to tell you, it's also your challenge. It's your challenge as citizens. It's your challenge as corporate leaders or non-for-profit leaders. You guys have to figure out how your institutions can play a role in that, because it's not good enough to sit back and say, wow, this is exhausting. Because for people who are given opportunities to have a broader platform to reach other people, to influence other institutions, this is the ball game. You have to help us figure this out. We sure don't have it down, but we spend every day, every story, sometimes every hour, thinking about issues closely related to this. With that, I'm going to relinquish you. I hope we can engage more during the conference itself, but I really appreciate the chance to talk with you, and take care.
Thank you so much, Dave. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Nicole Bassett, who through many years of work and through her most recent venture, the Renewal Workshop, is trying to transform the apparel industry and provide a model for all industries to move from a linear economy to a circular economy.
Hello, my name is Nicole Bassett. I am the co-founder of the Renewal Workshop, and I'm excited to talk with you today about the evolution of sustainability. Now, I started in sustainability back in 2005. I was working at Patagonia, and it actually was a year that the company was writing its first sort of corporate social responsibility report. We had done a bunch of calculations on how much paper we had recycled, making sure the printers were on double-sided, that the energy that was used in the building, collection of information about carpooling. And when we combined the report together, sort of looked at it, and it's a little, underwhelming, because we all sort of knew in our heart of hearts that this isn't really where the impact of the business is. Sure, these were our headquarters and our operations, but if we were going to make some real change, we had to look at where that was happening. That's just an example of the start of where sustainability was. And I want to talk through my career and how it's evolved in its implementation and our awareness of our impact as humans and where it's going. And then I'll talk a little bit about my company, the Renewal Workshop, and what we're doing related to sustainability within the circular economy. So from those early meetings at Patagonia, when we recognized, okay, it's not about recycling paper, but it is about where do we make impact. And at the end of the day, the real material impact for a company like Patagonia and all the apparel brands out there is in what you make. So you'll see this evolution of more and more companies starting to take a really hard look at the impact of the supply chain and what they make and the materials that go into the products and the people who make those products. I was at Patagonia for about 5 years and worked a lot in the supply chain, and then went on to take a role at Prana, which is another outdoor apparel company. And Prana had a real interesting situation in the sense that the company has a name, which those of you in the room who are yogis, you would know prana means life force. So it's sort of like the essence of life. And of course, many people are like, oh, then you have to be caring about the planet if that's the name of your company. And early days, that wasn't necessarily true. I mean, there were some small little projects. I always say like sustainability by a project. So companies are sort of like, oh, we could go do this little thing, or we could work on this. And, but it was never tied to strategy. It was never tied to actually going and making a real difference in a way that was going to be measurable and meaningful. So when I started the company, one of the first things we did is we looked at, okay, what is the strategy of the company? What's our plan? And it was making great product, and we wanted to grow the business. So we looked at, then that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the product, and we're going to focus on the materials that we use, and we're going to focus on the supply chain. And when I started the company in 2009, we did, we just started like at the base, like, what do we do? What don't we do? What can we evolve from here? I looked at how do we get more organic cotton into our company? How do we get more recycled materials? At that time, fair trade was one of the new options for the apparel industry, and Prana was one of the first brands to bring fair trade apparel to the US market. So we invested a lot of effort here, but we were always challenged by in a good way, we were always challenged that we were owned by a private equity company who had a very strict boundaries around finances. So it wasn't like we could just be sustainable for sustainability's sake. It had to be really tied to the ethos of the company, the branding, the marketing, and the consumer. And we saw a huge amount of increase in interest in the brand, allegiance to the brand, as we started investing more and more into sustainability. In those early days, I had to write a lot of business cases, why we should do these things, what value does it bring? And it always felt like a real uphill battle of having to justify doing the right thing for the planet. Over the years, Prana now, they're probably a leader in their packaging around like plastic-free packaging. They only use organic cotton now, the definitely leader in fair trade. And the company has really sort of doubled down on purpose as its branding. And that was an amazing evolution to watch a company go through that and say, oh, wow, it is possible. And they can still grow and they can still be profitable. Now, I'm going to sort of bring you to the next chapter of what a sustainability started to undertake. And this came to me from an example. This sort of showed up for me when I was traveling. I think I was in Cambodia at a factory. It wasn't a Prana factory, but I may have been traveling with some other people. But it was a factory making something like for Walmart or something, so a huge company. And I remember standing in the factory and looking turning my body all the way in one direction and then all the way in another, and seeing just tens of thousands of pink t-shirts getting made. And it really struck me in that moment that who is going to buy all these t-shirts, and where are all these t-shirts going to go when we are done with them? And does the world need this many pink t-shirts? And the answer really was yes, it does, because of the business model that we've created. The only way for a brand to grow its revenue is to just keep making more stuff. This landed for me again in another conversation I had years later. I was, when Prana got bought by Columbia Sportswear, we were sitting around talking about the projections for the next fiscal year. And I think we were saying like, oh, okay, well, we have to grow 20%. And someone said, oh, I guess then we make 20% more stuff. And I thought to myself, oh, does the world need us to grow 20% more? Does the world need 20% more stuff? Or we just have to do that because our business model is tied to that. And that's when I really realized that the next evolution of sustainability is not the products and its impact or how the business runs itself. It's the business model of the industry. So to give you an example of that, we are in the business model we are in today is linked very much to the economy we are in today. And that is a linear economy. So linear means we basically take raw materials from the earth, design and create clothes, sell them, someone uses them, and then maybe they donate it or give to a friend, or it ultimately at the end of its life is going to end up in landfill because there's no system in place to capture the resources of that product efficiently. The whole system for a brand is designed to take, make, sell, and then at the end of that, it's sort of meant to just go away. Brands are not set up, and nor do they want to be set up to be taking their stuff back, because it's a cost, and it's actually cheaper just to destroy or donate product and get it out of the system. That model was fine. It served companies well for decades because we didn't really have to think about, are we running out of resources? Do we really care about garbage? Landfill's really cheap, especially in the US. And so we just built systems and businesses all around that. Fortunately, there's an alternative to that, and that's this idea of a circular economy. Now, the circular economy is an idea that's been around for a long time, really refined by people much smarter than me. And the concept is that we have an economy that moves goods and finance, money, through a system where it's constantly evolving and changing and exchanging, so that there's this sort of wealth generation occurring. But it's based more on the planet and nature and thinking through what has value and how do you change that value over time. So I love the circular economy concept. I grew up in northern British Columbia. I love the outdoors. I love how beautiful an ecosystem is. Taking, you look at a tree that's dead in the forest, and things are growing out of it, and it's giving back nutrients to the soil, and it's creating new habitats, and it is in a cycle of its life, and it's not done. It's not just because a tree fell down and is dead, it's not done. It's still giving and contributing. And so we think about, how does an economy start to work that way, and how does a business start to work that way? So the Renewal Workshop, one of the company that I founded, we started the company to specifically figure out how to help brands unlock that linear model that they're on and offer options for the products that they've created for right now, and then give information and help collect information in such a way that allows us to then inform future design, future products, so that the company can ultimately change to be circular over time. So the Renewal Workshop works with apparel and textile companies, so home goods, bags, that kind of thing. And we take all the products that were once considered waste. So this could be returns, it could come back from a take-back program, it could be warranty, any product that is at the end of its use. A brand, then that product comes to our factory, where we're going to extend the life of that product. So we clean everything, we repair things if they need to be repaired, we re-quality check it all, and then we make it available for sale again for the brands. So we build websites that are white labeled, so a brand can come and create their own branded renewed shopping experience. And we do all the fulfillment and services around that. We also take the products that are too damaged and we sort them, and there's different options for that material. So some can get reused again in like an upcycling type way. So making a tote bag out of a tent, or are some materials that can get recycled, and those fibers then get shredded and turned into new yarns and can create new products. So the idea here is not to let anything go to waste, and really find ways to capture the value of that product all the way through its life cycle. And we've had some incredible success over the last 5 years. The North Face is probably our most well-known client. They have a program, the North Face Renewed. We work with a home goods company, Koyuchi, and they also have their own online store in which they resell their products. And they also had, because of the material type that they have in bedding, which is mostly cotton, they've actually made a product that is recycled out of their old product, really showing that you can close the loop and you can create a circular business model. What this has done is it's shown that these brands can now generate revenue not tied to making new stuff. So if you look at a car company like Toyota, you can go buy a new car, you can buy a pre-owned certified car, and their business model is actually starting to evolve into more circular. So you don't just rely on the new, you think through these different life cycles of a product and go, oh, this is where I can make money there, this is where I can make money there. And that's how you start to see an opportunity of financial growth not linked to resource use. And for me, that is ultimately the opportunity that we're sitting on in sustainability, and how to evolve sustainability into a way where it's not just about what you do, but it's about the ecosystem in which you do it in. I think that I'm super inspired by what's happening in the world today, and what brands are starting to think about renting their products instead of just selling them, leasing, reselling their products, designing for disassembly, designing for recyclability. The the world and the way we engage with our things is going to change dramatically, and it needs to happen if we're going to have a planet that's going to allow all of us access to wealth, access to healthy lives, to clean air. Then we have to create a way in which we are not tying our financial growth to the earth that they have and we need to protect. And it's really good business. So thank you for your time. And I really appreciate being able to share my journey, my story, and the ideas of circular.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And last, but certainly not least, I'd like to turn our attention to a proud alum of the Pepperdine Graziadio Business School's EMBA program, Executive MBA program, Jonathan Tan, who is going to talk about efforts to promote and enhance stability and sustainability in our nation's food system, specifically the last mile, grocery stores, food services.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tan, along with Aaron Daly, formerly of Whole Foods, Director of Global Sustainability, and Peter Cook, the creator of the Grocery Stewardship Certification Program. We co-founded Ratio Institute. And Ratio Institute is a project of Ecology Action, which is a 50-year-old 501c3. So before I get started, I'd like to say thank you very much to Mr. Bickle and the SEER program, of course, Pepperdine. And just so that everyone knows, I actually am an alumni of the Graziadio Executive MBA program, and thumbs up to the program. I appreciate all the faculty and all of the folks here at Pepperdine. Again, thank you very much today for the opportunity to speak. So today we're going to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. It's centered around these high global warming potential, or GWP, refrigerants that we have in our grocery stores. And it turns out just in the state of California, due to high GWP emissions, there's over 20 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent that is released into the atmosphere every single year. And over 28% of that is from our local grocery stores. And I'm not putting them on blast. It's not necessarily their fault. These grocers don't wake up in the morning and go, man, I have this great idea. Let's leak these high global warming potential refrigerants into the atmosphere. It's quite the contrary, in fact. They're trying to figure out how we, the consumer, want to have fruits and vegetables and different products from all over the world, and we want them fresh right now, today, regardless of whether it's March or if it happens to be July or November, and whether these fruits, vegetables, or other products are even in season. And so you think of the extreme costs, and you think of the operational requirements to be able to bring these goods and these products to our grocery stores is very time consuming, and it's very expensive to them. And so as you can imagine, in our grocery stores, these are living, breathing things. On average, a little over 40,000 square feet, have a little over 200 associates that work there. And aside from our place of vocation, whether it's school or work or whatever it is that we do, the place that we go the most often is where we buy our groceries. And so you have all of these people that are coming in and out of these grocery stores. So you think about the energy intensity, you think about the interactions that they have, and you think about the different types of activities that happen in here. And these refrigeration systems aren't like your refrigerator at home, sitting there, self-contained, away from any harm or any other people. It takes a whole lot to leak a charge of refrigerant out of your refrigerator at home. These systems in the grocery store are not like that. People are actually on the sales floor. There is piping and things that are in the way, although you may most of the time may not even see it, but there are opportunities and chances for different things to be exposed depending on what happens in a grocery store at any particular time on any particular day. And so these refrigerants invariably get leaked into the atmosphere. And we're going to talk more about that, what that looks like and some of those conditions. But I've been talking about how we can get there. And we're going to talk about some of the regulations that are in place today. But again, these grocers aren't thinking, hey, I really want to leak into the atmosphere. So we're going to talk about combining energy efficiency projects to help create cash flows to get rid of these high global warming potential refrigerants. So with that said, let's get started. So first off, Ratio Institute, our mission, quite simply, accelerate the viability and measurability and sustainability in food retail. Blah, 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 a lot of words. One of the things is when we talk about expert collaboration, having the opportunity to talk here in this forum, in the annual SEER conference, to be able to get the word out and get everybody to understand. Again, we're not putting these grocers on blast. It's more of how can we help them? How can we, as whether it's state, city, federal, consumers, and create kind of the better for all of us, because we all have a stake in this game. And then our vision really is to build a successful and sustainable food retail industry. And the big component in this is viable for everyone, a viable future for everyone. So again, we're going to talk about some of the demographics and some of the numbers here in just a moment regarding just the state of California, but we are looking nationally and we do work globally as well. But many of our grocery stores are in disadvantaged communities. Many of them are in non-attainment zones. And so for those unfamiliar, a non-attainment zone are areas that are disproportionately affected by CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions. So often considered to be, areas with a lot of pollution. And many of those grocery stores fall in both those quote unquote DAC, disadvantaged communities, and high non-attainment zones, just as an example. So we want this to be for everyone. We're not only looking at environmental change, but there's also, environmental sustainability, but there's also social sustainability, right? These grocery stores provide jobs, they provide services. Sometimes they're even providing healthcare, depending on the grocer and where they're at. As you may see, especially with coronavirus, many grocers are starting to be able to provide the vaccines. So these are very important key pieces of our communities. And again, it's not to punish them, in my mind, it's more, how can we make them even more viable? How can we help them, pay their employees more and provide more benefits? How can we make them more profitable so they can be better stewards of their respective communities? So again, we're going to talk more about this. So here's what we're going to talk about. Why now? Why is this all of a sudden a thing? We're going to get through that. We're going to give you that snapshot of what's going on here in California. Again, this is true throughout the rest of the country. But as you can imagine, as far as if you look at the population of California relative to the rest of the United States, we have about the same proportion of grocery stores in our state as well. And there's some things going on here in the state that are pushing some of these things. And the state of California has an opportunity to be a leader. So that's, again, why, one of the reasons why we are actually targeting California. And of course, born and raised, live here in California. I live in Ventura. So it's very important to me as well. We're going to talk about the opportunities. We're going to talk about the challenges. And then we're going to talk about, again, how energy efficiency might be that catalyst to help us get where we need to go. So why now? We are leaking more than 2.3 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually, and this is legally, into our atmosphere from the refrigerants from these systems. And again, it's not people that are bad. These aren't things that the grocers want to do. It is very costly and very expensive for them to deal with these types of leaks. And again, these leaks aren't necessarily even to their own fault. There are just little things that can happen, where you might have a vendor who comes in and runs a fork truck into a main line. There's not much that you can do about that. And even though that many of these lines are in, you know, less conspicuous kind of places, it still happens. These are the types of things that still happen because, again, these stores are living, breathing entities. There are people in them every single day. We can't account for everything. So there's a lot of stuff that happens there. The other thing that's a big why now is we have a calculator now that has been approved by the CPUC, that's the California Public Utility Commission, that actually quantifies the social value of greenhouse gas equivalents. So we have a way to actually put a value to this. And then lastly, existing energy efficiency projects are actually happening. We've been doing these types of things in the state of California for the better part of 40 years, looking at the future and trying to curb our energy usage. As you can imagine, the strain on our grid, the amount of power that we have to produce, all of these things. These things have been happening for quite a long time. So what's the snapshot look like? We have over 4,000 grocery stores in the state, actually closer to 5,000. And these grocery stores are kind of, you know, roughly split, 45% of those national brands, 55% independently owned. Independently owned, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't operate nationally, but they are privately held. And within the state of California, many of those are owned and operated within the state. The industry doesn't make a whole lot of money. 1.2% average net income. So they generate a lot of cash. They don't make a whole lot of money. So it makes it very difficult for them to do these types of things. The capital required to change out these refrigerants or these systems is very capital intensive. And quite frankly, we have a large install base. We're going to talk about some of the regulations here in just a moment. But if we were to convert a store a day, starting today, we will not meet the 2030 goals. And we're going to be over 1,000 stores short, even if we've started converting right now. And then we talked about it just a moment ago about those disadvantaged communities and non-attainment zones. Many of these independents, that's where they operate. So they are very viable and important parts of our respective communities. Here are the codes. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but basically, we have two big key components. One, there's a step requirement in 2026, where if you own more than 20 grocery stores, you need to reach a GWP, global warming potential, of 2,500. Not expressly important for everyone to really grasp that, but as an example, a very viable local grocer owned and operated in California, their average global warming potential across their estate is almost 3,600. And they operate well over 50 stores within the state. So to give you an idea, to be able to get down to a number of 2,500 is going to be a little bit difficult for them to meet the step goal. And then the end goal is by 2030, they need to be below 1,400. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of these numbers and what that all means. But at the end of the day, if we don't act now, we're going to release well over 20 million metric tons just waiting for these grocers to meet code. This is just talking about the calculator that we just mentioned. Basically, it's an Npv calculator that was, again, created by E3. And how it's used is effectively you can utilize the gas that someone is using today in the calculator. It gives you a value in dollars and an Npv over till 2030. And you can put any type of year and other requirements around it. And then you put what you would use instead. And then you subtract those two numbers, and that's the net present value. So here's kind of the opportunity. We're looking at 2030 as the end date, and I'm just talking about 400 stores. So we're talking less than 10% of the total population of stores in the state. But here's what it's worth. So we have this scenario A, code minimum 1,400 GWP. So if I were to convert 400 stores today with a new GWP refrigerant, which exists at about 1,400 GWP, it would cost the grocers over $30 million to just do those conversions. And today, there is no motivation for these grocers to spend this money whatsoever. The only motivation is the 2026 or the 2030 number of hitting those numbers. And so we talked about it, 1.2% average net income. So if you look at the amount of cash that is required to be able to get there, we're talking about, well over, and, I thought I had done the math and I had it in my notes. So let's just call a spade and say I can't find it. That's over $250 million in groceries that need to be sold to be able to get there. Not going to happen. And oh, by the way, what is that value to us? Well, just as an example, those 400 stores in scenario A, that's 1.8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent avoided between now and 2030. Again, big number, massive number. And how does that equate? That's approximately 70% of the annual number that PG&E basically emits from the generation of the power that they generate each year. It's a big number. Or it's over 20 million megawatts of energy efficiency. So when you're talking about changing out lighting to LED or adding controls or doing different things with HVAC or refrigeration or other technologies, we would need to do 20 million megawatt hours. It's impossible. We can't even get there. And the new calculator that we just discussed shows an NPV benefit of greater $128 million to the state of California. That's what it's worth to the state. So the state is getting a benefit from removing or preventing rather that refrigerant from being leaked into the atmosphere. Scenario B is even better. So scenario B means instead of using a chemical, so in scenario A, we're going from one chemical, man-made, and we've deemed it, let's just call it what it is, bad. And we're going to another chemical that we're deeming less bad. It's still 1,400 times, right, as potent or as negative impact to our atmosphere than one, right? So if we take 1 metric ton of this gas, that's 1,400 GWP versus 1 metric ton of just carbon, it would be 1. And so that's what scenario B is. We're using CO2. It has a GWP of 1. So if we took those same 400 stores and we converted those to CO2 systems, which actually is even more cost intensive, because at that point, all those refrigerated cases that you see on the sales floor are eliminated. You have to replace everything, including the piping. That's an upgrade cost of over $600 million. And again, if we take our, grand old calculator, which again, I thought I had my notes, it's $500 million to be able to get there. Of selling groceries to be able to pay for those upgrades. Not going to happen. And these systems can last, these new systems can last for 20 years. So we would save over 5.7 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent from being released into the atmosphere. That's over 2 times the annual emissions by PG&E from generating power. That's over 62 million megawatt hours. At this point, it's cartoon numbers. They're just so big. And it's a net present value to the state of over $341 million. So we're getting a benefit. And today we already pay for a lot of this through public service charges, through many of the utility bills that we pay, regardless of where you live here within the state. So it's already things that we're already paying for, and we can divert funds to offset this. So we talked about those 2 different opportunities. This is just some of that big math. Just kind of go through it. So nerd math, I'm showing it up here on the screen so that everyone has an opportunity, and you're going to get these presentations later, so you can go through and look at this. And at the bottom, it's got the assumptions from the technical component. The real big thing is there is a lot of financial benefit to the state for helping to fund this and figure out a way to fund it. And there's obviously an environmental impact benefit to this. And here's scenario B. We'll stick on here for just a moment. Again, $340 million in social benefit to the state. So we can help these businesses be viable. We can help these businesses maintain their employees and maintain their operations. There's already stories about Ralph's, which is a Kroger brand, that have closed stores within Los Angeles because of the hazard pay, so to speak, from coronavirus. These people are putting themselves on the line because they feel like they have to. Many of them don't have sick time. Many of them, need to have a constant paycheck. And so they put themselves there out on the line, and they do that at the behest of the consumer, right? We want to, hey, I want to go into my grocery store and I want to go get jamon from Spain, right? I mean, we have first world problems. Let's call it what it is. And this is a way to keep these businesses viable and keep those jobs there and be able to pay fair wages and to be able to be more profitable. And this is one way we can do it. So what's our challenge? Extremely capital intensive. We said that before. There are no incentives. And what I mean by incentives, there's no motivation. We got that here in the next one too, but there's nothing today that makes the grocer say, I want to go out and do this. It is an extreme capital and intensive type of work for them to go and do it. And so they don't get any operational savings from doing it. They don't really get any benefits. You're just swapping one gas for another gas. So you still have to deal with it. You still have leaks. You still have repairs. You still have things you have to do. You just would have to do it because I don't want to get fined. So there's no motivation. That's it, just the code. And we talked about that. Meeting that code is prohibitive, especially for a lot of these independent grocers. So how do we motivate the retailers? How do we get it to act now? Because we as the consumer, right, we talked about that social benefit. We're getting part of that benefit. Well, we have some of the tools already available today. The 2018 California Cooling Act is actually there now. It allows the California Public Utility Commission to utilize funds for energy efficiency to be able to be utilized to offset these greenhouse gases, number one. Number two, we can create cash flows. So with energy savings, right? So I'm paying, most of these grocers are anywhere, north of $250,000 in energy that they spend. So if we're creating energy efficiency and I can go into most grocery stores, not work that hard, and I can find 20% to as much as 40% reduction in energy. So 40%, that's $100,000. So I could create a positive cash flow, and I can use that, right? I'm already paying $250,000. If I can save $100,000, I could use those savings to help pay for these upgrades. And then if I can get an energy efficiency booster, right? You're already paying a public surface charge. Those already exist. The state and all of, everyone that lives here that has a utility bill is already paying a quote unquote tax that already exists. Instead of using it for energy efficiency, we talked about how much greater reducing these refrigerants is versus the energy efficiency. We can just move those money over and we can create a cash flow that works for these grocers to move now. And then there's a tool called on-bill financing. And what that means is you basically get a loan from the utility, and it's backed by the California Public Utility Commission, and you pay for it right on your bill. So we talked about $250,000, per store. So that's a little over $20,000 per month on average. They straight line your usage, and then whatever your energy savings is. So we talked about, 100,000 in this particular example, right? So that's, call it $8,000 a month, give or take. And so now that 8,000 can go towards paying off a loan. And then you can run that out to 5 years or even 10 years. And whatever that capital cost is, you're just using that energy savings to pay for that loan. And at the end of the day, the retailer is no worse for wear. And then lastly, there are projects that are happening today. We have a B corporation called Taper that is out there doing energy efficiency. They're doing LED lighting. They're doing controls upgrades. They're doing refrigeration work, HVAC work. And there are no shortage of firms in the state of California that are doing these types of things. And it's so much easier to do this work at the same time. The utilities, CPUC, they call it stranded savings. When you're not able to get additional savings, you go in, kind of get the low-hanging fruit and leave. They understand that it's incrementally more expensive to go back and the opportunities to get some of these higher level of savings is so much harder. So we can use energy efficiency today to get these types of savings, to promote this kind of change, to have social benefit to the state now. I've given this presentation already to IGSD and several other regulators. IGSD is the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. And then additionally, there was an article in February in the Washington Post. The author of that article was Juliet Eilaprin, and she was nice enough to be able to find Ratio Institute and me, and we were able to contribute to that article. So hopefully this will leave with you, and you might be able to help us in this, this road to start getting this change to happen, and hopefully start curbing some of the climate change that we're seeing today. And again, thank you so much to SEER, to Rob, to Pepperdine for the opportunity to speak today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I hope to see you, each of you, soon, and we get through all of this together. Cheers, everyone. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay. Well, welcome. What an amazing array of information. I realize that we're a little bit long on time, and I want to quickly turn to Wole because I realize you've got to leave in like 2 minutes. So I'm going to actually, Wole, Dave, if you could hold on for a sec, because I'm going to give Wole one of those National Public Radio 2-minute answers if he's there and can answer. We do have a question from the audience about how does financial education factor into these plans to expand opportunity. I don't know, Wole, if you can respond to that in the minute that you have left.
Give me the question one more time. And Dave,
sure. So basically, how does financial education for these underserved communities factor into these plans to integrate the digital access and the mobile banking?
Yeah, so financial education is a great question, and I'll answer any of the questions in writing. Financial education is important, but I think of financial education as being important in a just-in-time scenario. People don't sort of need that until they know they need it, kind of thing. And I do agree that it should be a core part of our educational system. We don't do a good job of that in the various schools, but at the same time, if someone's under financial duress, it's hard for them to figure out how to think about saving for retirement because they're trying to get through the moment. So I think it's a little bit of making available the information when people need it, and at the same time doing a better job of making it available to young people while they're in school.
All right. Well, I know you have to jump off, and I really thank you for your participation. It's a wonderful topic and so timely with the Angelino card coming out.
Absolutely. So thanks, everybody, and best of luck. And Rob, it's great to see you, and thanks for
you too. Take care.
Bye.
Oh, okay. So next up, we have Dave, this is going to shock you, but people were really interested in how the traditional media can sort of deal with the overwhelming influence of social media. And there's a really interesting idea of, the idea of social tribalism. And how do you crack that? How do you break through these sort of these bubbles that we've crafted for ourselves?
It's a great question. First, let me thank you folks for listening to what we're saying here and to say what a great treat it is to be on a panel as distinguished as the folks you've seen, people like Wole, Nicole, Jonathan, and for that matter, Rob Bickel himself, embracing their passions and trying to bring meaning into our otherwise sordid lives. In terms of traditional media, I think we have my colleagues and I and our counterparts have a really tough challenge there because it feels a little bit like you're holding up a handkerchief in a hurricane, trying to hold back this incredible tsunami or wave of information and misinformation and disinformation, and to sort it out. We are in the business of acquiring information and sifting through it and figuring out what's real, what makes sense, separating, as Nate Silver popularized the phrase, that the noise from the chatter, from meaning. And it's hard. One of the ways we do it is come at it with a degree of humility that we're not imposing what we believe to be the case on facts,
that we may have an idea going out in a story of where it may lead, but we have to be completely open to it surprising us. And that's almost always the case if you leave your mind open enough. One editor once described journalism less as painting on a blank canvas than doing sculpture, chipping away at the marble to reveal what's underneath. And to do that in a way which is consistent and does honor to the facts and people's lives as they're lived. In a decade ago, I would have said part of what we have to do is just commonplace now. You link to things, to primary sources, to original videos. You make sure you give people excerpts that are long enough that they can understand the context in which things were said or presented or actions were taken. And also so that they have faith that the way you're recounting it is real. And I think that's really important. Nowadays, I think that some of what you're seeing is the willingness to stick with stories. Let's take something as incredibly important as the insurrection against the siege of the Capitol building, an attack on our legislative seat of government on the 6th of January. You've seen extraordinary journalism done by my colleagues, by folks at the New York Times, by a lot of other major news organizations, where they compile official video, news reporting, raw material, posts from hundreds or thousands of social media accounts, and try to put them together in a sequence, testing each fact and making sure they're sure of each assertion, to put together a compelling kind of timeline narrative of what happened, maybe in specific moments or maybe for the siege itself. And in doing that, we're saying, we're not just going to tell you on the first day. We're not simply going to rush and tell you 48 hours and get distracted. We're going to stick with things that matter and really explain. And if we got something wrong, we're going to tell you. And we're going to continue to present to you the material that you need to understand. Sometimes it means saying, this is what we don't know. But it is hard. This is a faith that is hard to earn and easy to squander. And I think that we have to kind of go about earning that trust on almost a daily basis. We can't be distracted. I'll finish this answer very quickly, but we can't be distracted by every little surge that happens on social media. One of the things journalists have to keep saying to each other as a mantra is that Twitter is not real life. What seems calamitous or a crisis or overwhelming on Twitter, it may be overwhelming in certain ideological corners or bubbles. And we need to give people the information they need to be able to make sense of that, but not also think that that is the only determiner of where our gaze goes.
So those are the loudest voices, and you've got to is the hope that there's a I don't want to use the phrase silent majority, but let's call them quiet plurality out there that is more receptive to reasoned information as opposed to virulent sound bites.
It's almost like it's the loudest voice where any one group is listening at that moment, but that may not be a shared auditorium. That may not be the same bubble other people are doing. Your trending topics may be a little different than mine, depending on where you are, depending on your demographic, depending on your psychographic, your ideological outlook, where you are, what you click on, or what social media platforms you use. And so the things that journalists use tend to be self-fulfilling, and we've got to remember that that's not life as it's entirely lived. But we do have to equip you with both the knowledge and the tools to be good consumers. Let's be honest. And I think I said this in the talk, forgive me if I'm breaking the fourth wall here, but we taped these conversations. I haven't had that in front of me to review. Thanks, Dave. Thanks. What's my line, Rob? In any event, the thing is that it's hard. It's like graduate level stuff, being a news consumer these days, and you've got to dip in and test it. And I do think that we are presenting you with more material than you have ever had before, and that is both a blessing and a curse. And not all of that is reliable, and you guys have to sample different sources to put things together to trust it. But I do think the best news sources, and there's some newer entries that are just fabulous, really take you seriously. They don't talk down to you. They take you along for the ride. They treat you as knowledgeable as they are. And one of the things, and I'm going to say this again about public radio, that I really love is you present people in their own voices so you can hear them, so you can trust that these are the people speaking for themselves with their intonation, their emotional freight and weight. But you also give them time to speak. So they're not just 3 to 8 second sound bites that you might hear on the nightly news. and you're treating both your listeners with respect, but also the subjects and sources of your stories with respect, so they have an ability to articulate the points they're trying to get across.
All right. Well, first of all, I have to thank Will and Kayla, who are students who wrote in questions basically around that, and also say that a number of very nice comments about you from the listeners.
Well, despite that, I hope these are discerning, participants at your
Well,
conference.
obviously, those are the people that you're talking about right there with the
Right
reasonable
there.
adults. All right. Well, David, thank you so much. I know you have an editor that's screaming for your time. And so thank you again for being here, and great seeing you.
Pleasure to see you. A strong beard game, Robbie. And,
there we go.
Best of
all.
Take
After you.
Take care.
Okay. Bye, Dave. All right. So with that, and proceeding in order, if we're okay. By the way, Nicole, it's great to see your face. And Jonathan as well. It's great. I'm so grateful that all of you were able to participate and share your wisdom. So Nicole, we had a number of questions about how does circularity, combat this sort of rampant consumerism, and what's the role of the consumer? You're smiling because I know that this is, I'm sure you get this all the time, but like how does a consumer counter this sort of like this now ingrained need to just constantly purchase everything all the time, cheap products, and fill our closets all the time, and our garages with stuff, and how can the circular model sort of, or what do you see as being the antidote to that aspect of the problem?
Well, I like how you asked that. I have not answered it in that way before. So let me think about this. So there's sort of two parts. So one, I personally don't feel like putting all of the burden of change on the consumer is the right choice. It's sort of punting the problem down to people who don't have the same access to certain resources or can make certain decisions. So I kind of look at how do we make the big change upstream and how businesses operate. So a lot of things where people are like, oh, fast fashion is destroying the planet. And yes, because we are, it enabled us to consume more, right? But it also served in a lot of ways because it democratized fashion and allowed other people to get access to clothing that people couldn't. So we don't want to throw it all out. What we want to look at is like, what is the bigger system that a circular economy can start to create to give more benefit to consumers so that consumers can make better choices. I think fashion and trends will never go away. And so this idea of new is something that we can't just expect brands to just make, black turtlenecks and white shirts. We have to acknowledge that there's a desire of creativity and self-expression. But how can that happen in a sustainable way? So some really interesting business models that are coming out of circular obviously is sharing, rental, accessing new products for you, but not necessarily new products. So that's sort of like a consumer side of it. On the industry side of it, what I'm inspired by right now, and I think is very important, is that companies recognize that the business model and the world in which they're selling into is changing, and that instead of sort of doubling down on the old way of doing it, is to start to really invest in a new way of engaging with the consumer by offering new business models and not being scared of making less. And I think that has been the thing when I talked about in my talk, went throughout Patagonia, throughout Prana, there was sort of we don't talk about making less because we don't have a business model to support how do we grow without that. Whereas in the last 5 years, what's been very interesting is the apparel industry has shifted a lot, not enough, not even close to enough, but more than I've ever seen before towards oh yeah, we'll try selling our stuff again. Okay, we'll try renting our product. Okay, we'll try doing different ways of accessing or getting the consumer access to our product. And that's where I feel like there's a lot of options for that change. So kind of coming back if you as a consumer wants to make a sort of tangible difference, I think go use those new business models, because the more people who use those new business models, that is the factor that that brands take into consideration and go, oh yeah, there's money to be made here because someone's actually doing the thing that we are testing or trying out.
All right. So, and I think if we think about the entire value chain, because there was another question from Sarah about how this transition can happen without leaving all those sort of the global suppliers at the beginning of the linear value chain, without cutting them out and leaving them in the lurch.
Yeah, the way I look at that question is one, always make that front and center. Like we can't lose sight of that and just think like, oh, we're going to over here in sort of like North America and solve for circular and not acknowledge that all of the stuff came from Asia or India or various countries all over the world. And the way I look at it is, how do we do better in our supply chains so that marginalized communities where we have, we don't pay enough for our cotton and we don't consider workers' rights as important as we should, that there is more effort put on making sure that those people are taken care of inside of a circular economy. And also what we're going to run into is the problem in the near future, not right now. So in the near future, we're going to have plots of land that once had cotton on it, and we want to, we have plots of land that are just feral, and we want to like expand cotton production because we need exponential growth of cotton. We're going to run into a land problem. We won't have enough land for all of this exponential growth that we think we will in the industry. So acknowledging that now and preparing, so it's not necessarily about, oh, the people right now are going to all lose their jobs. It's how do you transition the people of the future to say there may not be as many agriculture jobs in the long-term future, but how do you raise the level of the livelihood of the people that are there so that they can go on and take on different types of jobs?
So it sounds a little similar to like the renewable energy transition from the fossil fuel. It's sort of like figuring out how that works, and it's not going to be it sounds like you're saying it's not going to be flipping a switch that, suddenly all these factories are just going to go dark.
Right.
In Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, Nicole, I thank you. I realize this is super rapid fire, but thank you so much. It's great seeing you again. And I think this is just like we're at this really exciting moment with circularity as it's become more, it's gone from something that's been sort of wonkishly academic to something that's so mainstream right now and really, really exciting. So look forward to staying in touch with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. All right. And Jonathan, again, last but not least, I get to say that twice. It's great to see you. There was so much dense information in your presentation. And I was a little worried, I have to say. I was like, oh man, this has gotten really technical. But we got some really great technical questions that I actually haven't even had the time to read thoroughly. So I'm gonna take a leap of faith here and read the question out loud. So there's one from Aaron on the topic of GWP emissions, climate change. A huge piece of the puzzle seems to be knowing the answer to this question: how much of the refrigeration is allocated for space of meat and dairy? And then, I think that this is tying it into the disproportionate carbon footprint of those products, versus other products as well, and that might be less carbon intensive throughout, not just at the last mile, but throughout the value chain. And so, are you looking at trends in that as well, or?
Well, and this is a tough part. So, I mean, to answer the question as far as a percentage, right? So, for the meat and dairy, I mean, depending on the retailer, depending on, there's a lot of factors that go into that, but I mean, it's as much as 60 to 80% of that refrigeration dedicated to those products, right? So meat and dairy, things that are coming from an animal. So, I don't try to, promote veganism or vegetarianism or how, I don't want to try to pretend, hey, here's how one should eat, right? How you should consume products and those kinds of things. But yes, we know that, right, the raising and slaughtering of animals and the use of, their different types of products is very carbon intensive, right? And the amount of land and all of the things that go into those kind of components as far as the creation of these products. So that's where, you know, I hate to say it, on the opposite end of Nicole, right? That's a little bit on the consumer side, right? Be mindful of where you're doing. You know, we also have to be very mindful of, you know, the socioeconomics of who we're talking about, right? Some of us are fortunate enough to say, okay, I can go to the butcher and afford grass-fed meat that's coming from, you know, a sustainably, you know, maintained farm and those kinds of things. Many people aren't in that situation. And unfortunately, the downside of it is that most of us are going to more pre-packaged, prepared foods. So when you want to start taking in like the total carbon footprint, start thinking about those other things that are made that have the plastics and the packaging, and then how does those things get, you know, disposed of. So it's not, none of this is an easy answer. It is not. We just look at it as grocery is like this nexus of sustainability when you start bringing into account all of the inputs and outputs, right? If you think of all, you know, think of the trucking and the transportation and the emissions from bringing these products to, we have roughly 40,000 grocery stores in the United States. Those are very specific, defined items, but there's another 50 some retail outlets that sell some sort of food. So you lump that all together and you just think of the trucking and the, you know, just on the transportation side, let alone, you know, some farming practices, right? So all of that is built into that nexus of sustainability. So it's not an easy answer, and it's, you know, where do you focus your time, energy, and efforts? No pun intended in any of that. And where does your heart lie? And we look at it as, I'm trying to do it, Ratio Institute's trying to do it at the retail spot, but there's no shortage of people that we are aligned with, that we work with, that we have either on our advisory or we have a member partnership with, that are doing more of that upstream type of work. But if you were to say, okay, outside of refrigerants and those kinds of things, like what would be the next thing I would personally be looking at? And it's the packaging, you know, the plastics and all that. And those people probably saw you know, maybe last week tonight from this past week, which really focused on plastics, which was a really good piece. There's some points in there that were missed. And of course they do sometimes a little, you know, over the top to where getting change is tough, but you know, plastics and packaging, that's another thing. Like if we want to take into that carbon footprint, it blows away this leaps and bounds.
Right, and we had another question about about how the impact of all this fresh food delivery, which is
so that's, you know, that goes into that transport question, and that's a really tough one that's really happening right now. There's folks that we're talking to and working with, and how they're tackling those kinds of problems. So think about that now, right? So especially in the United States, where whether you want to call it privilege, entitlement, you know, wealth, however you want to categorize it, right? We have to have a vehicle, right? We have one vehicle for one person. And you go to other countries and there's mass transit and there's, you know, there's a lot more ride sharing. And so now we can deliver things to us as well. And so we've just kind of ratcheted up that usage or those emissions relative to that transportation. So yeah, it's just astronomical, and how we go about doing these things is just insane. You and I are both here in Southern California, and we look at, you know, let's add another lane to the freeway instead of adding, you know, mass transit. And, you know, we get upside down for our roads are in disrepair. But, you know, if we were to make those economic choices of, okay, let's look at the mass transit and how is that beneficial versus that other lane, and what are the true costs associated with that? So, you know, these are not.
And I think, you know, part of the point is, you know, not letting perfect be the enemy of good, and saying we understand that this is a system process. There was a really great question from Rod about, you know, in Canada, they don't refrigerate milk because it's irradiated. And so that would obviously remove, and of course that you have to adjust the consumer expectations, and so it's not something you could just flip a switch on necessarily, but so there are system changes, but the idea that you and I think this is true for SEER also, is sort of understanding that it's supposed to operate, understanding that things operate as a system. It doesn't mean that you can't pull apart one piece and say we're going to focus energies, again, not to use the pun, but on this one piece. And so the fact that you've got your experience in refrigerants, and I know that you mentioned this in your talk, and I realize we're coming very close to time, but if you could, like, just in a few seconds, talk about what is the single greatest incentive for retailers to make these changes to their refrigeration systems?
Today, the only real reason is to not be fined. So these fines can be into the millions of dollars, depending on the number of incidences and how many days you actually get fined on a per day basis, in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, depending on the size and how egregious it is. So really, it's the stick right now. That's all that they have, is they have this large stick. And if you look at the jobs, right? So grocery represents 10% of our U.S. Retail GDP. It employs 25% of the workers.
Right.
So it's just this massive part of our economy. So if we were to just say, okay, you guys all have to do this tomorrow, you're going to put businesses out, and these are viable businesses that are big pieces,
essential workers.
Yeah, of their respective communities. So it's a tough deal. And so we're looking at ways of what already exists, and it's not going to take too much legislative work or too much policy kind of stuff. We can just go do it now. It's already there. We just got to tack a little bit left or right, and we can start doing some of this stuff now and impacting it now.
All right, Jonathan, I'm gonna have to leave it there because we're running out of time, but thank you so much. Thank you to all of our wonderful panelists for today. I would like to thank Kenesha Danley, who once again has helped to promote and put together a great event, and Hillary Duran and the marketing team, and our technical staff as well. And I've one last plug for those of you that are interested, that aren't already enrolled as a SEER MBA. We do an exec ed course in strategic CSR, basically a SEER course for executives. The next iteration is going to be in August on the 23rd and 24th. It's available through the Pepperdine Graziadio website. I encourage you to do that. And of course, if you really want to take a deep dive, enroll as an MBA and do the full SEER certificate here. So with that, in acknowledgement that Passover is coming up, for those of you that observe, there's a saying, next year in Jerusalem, next year in real life. We will come back and be amongst each other as human beings, interacting socially with other human beings. But this has been phenomenal. It's been wonderful to see the engagement. And I think it's been a great success. So we'll see how this moment gets seized in the future. Goodbye to everyone. Thank you for all your kind attention, and we'll see you soon.